really.
So we're gonna start with the basics.
Okay.
So you should tell me your full name and your age
Oh,
and where you grew up.
I'll say
And
Faus, 57 now. I was born in Colombia, South America. And after like 6 years traveling or living someplace else, I've lived here in Kansas City most of that time.
what brought you to Kansas City?
My mother moved here, and so we lived with my grandparent, my grandmother, my brother and I, and then after she'd been here and settled, about 2.5 years later, she sent for us and we came.
How old were you?
Oh God, I was 9 years old.
Where did you go traveling outside of here?
Been to South America, Mediterranean, Egypt, been to France, and then just, I've seen almost all of the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you're kind of like a KCK boy then.
No, Casey Mo.
Casey Mo?
Yeah. So we were like right over, the backyard used to look right over the stockyard.
Crazy. How was it different then?
Yeah, it was a lot of, in the projects where we lived in, when we first came, there were a lot of immigrants from Latin America. So that, I mean, some of the people that I remember, the kids that I hung out with were Ecuadorian, Peruano, they were some Cubano. It was just that political shift that was going on in South America, so I think some families, that was kind of like, for some of us, I think that was the entry point in.
Sure. How did your mom end up coming over here?
She married an American. She married, he was a pilot. He was still in the Air Force at that time, so a lot of her connections were to Fort Leavenworth. And then it was down here to the west side, which was probably the best place to be.
When you were growing up here, like what was your day-to-day life like?
I just remember it was school, there were people trying to teach us English. I remember just the games you play when you were a little kid. I remember, it was the British invasion when I came. So I remember this one kid, he had this mop he put on his head because that kind of like mimicked the Beatles. So we would sing, "She loves you, J, 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 J." Didn't know what it was.
So where do you live now? Do you live?
I wish I lived. I live in Overland Park right now. If I want to live someplace, I want to live in the middle of the city. I can't live in the in-between. And right now, living in the in-between is just difficult. I'm on the edge of the city, and I prefer to either be in the city or totally removed from the city. And then place becomes really important there, landscape becomes important. But, you know, being in the middle, in the suburb, is just deadly to me.
Yeah, I understand that. Do you ever go, like leaning more towards your art, do you ever go on like artist retreats, or is there anywhere that you go that's kind of away from everything?
I did a retreat in Wyoming for about a month, and that was excellent. I went to Bolivia and did a project there for 2.5 weeks. We took some trips to Mexico and we did some murals there. But sometimes the studio, I mean, to me the studio is my refuge, it's my retreat. I mean, it's pretty quiet, just the noise I make is mine. Yeah.
So does this kind of feel like your home?
Yeah, the studio, yeah, it's always, you know, I think ever since I started really committing to art, I've always had the idea that I had to have a dedicated space. If you don't have a dedicated space, and say like you make it in your home, there's so many distractions to be. Here, the only thing I've got is, yeah, I've got the great little chairs, but you know, I've got the work, and I've also got the idea that I pay for this space and like it a lot.
So you're invested in multiple ways in your home?
Yeah, emotionally, economically, and it's safe. I mean, it's just.
So when did you were talking about deciding to dedicate your life to being an artist. When did that start happening? Like, is it something where you've always been creative as a kid and it was a natural progression? Or?
I've always drawn, and I've always kind of written, but it was never like something where you look at it as, you know, this is what you're going to do for your life. I mean, it was, my mother was an artist, she was a dancer. She did classical, she did ballet, folklorico. She taught in our home when I was a kid. I saw dancers in the house. She had a wooden floor, she had the mirrors on the wall, there was classical music. Sometimes musicians were there. I can recall that vaguely as being a different kind of life than the one that my uncles or aunts lived. I can't honestly tell you who in our family didn't go to college. You know, it's in your blood, you just do that. So for me, art was not something I was thinking of as a career at all.
Sure.
In fact, when I went to college, I was going to be a political science major. first semester I was taking a really heavy load, political science stuff, and he said to me, you need a break, man. And there's this art teacher, and they have a model. You can, you like to draw. I'm sure she wouldn't mind if you wanted to just draw from the model. And I'd never drawn from the model, but I thought, that sounds kind of interesting. He was persuasive. Nobody else said, you got to go. So I went and asked the teacher, and I remember her looking at me and thinking, well, there's a naked model here, there's a young boy here. I'm sure that's what she was thinking. But she didn't turn me away. She said, she gave me a piece of paper, and she said, a large piece of paper, and said, okay, you can sit over there and let's just watch you draw. And by the end of the class, she said, you're welcome to come anytime you want to. By the time I was home that evening, I'd already made up my mind. So the next day I came in and I basically just dropped all the political science classes I had. The funny thing is that after I got out of college, I didn't do art for like a long time.
What'd you do?
I went and worked at a law firm. I did.
Every parent's dream.
Matter of fact, my mother used to tell people I was a lawyer. No, I went and worked at a law firm. I was trying to avoid getting a lot of debt. I took a part-time job, and the part-time job turned into a full-time job that turned into a 14-year job.
Mm-hmm. When you were doing that job, were you working on stuff outside of that? I mean, it sounds like art is kind of always in your life.
It was, but I can honestly tell you that what happened during that time was that I would go to events more than I actually was a participant in. There weren't that many galleries, there weren't that many theater companies or anything, but if one would come up, you go see them, You kind of lose perspective when you drop out of something. And but I was always at the margins. I would still draw now and then, I would paint now and then, and I would write. But it was not like a dedicated thing.
So you mentioned that, back in the day, art stuff kind of popped up now and then.
Yeah.
How is the art community in Kansas City and Kansas City, Kansas different now?
Well, oh God, it's night and day, honestly.
It's kind of exploded,
yeah,
right? That's my understanding.
It has exploded in many ways. I think the thing was, honestly, it's like, I remember when getting out of school, most of the people I knew, almost all of them, they wanted to do art. Their idea was, I'm going to go to grad school, or I'm going to get out of Kansas City. Like that density of things, it was just things you ran into. There were like little things that would pop up like that you would hear about and you'd go and be a part of. The concentration that you have now is just insane. I mean, I just got done from taking some paintings over to a guy and have a party tonight, they eat art. It's like, yeah, okay.
And that's just par for the course now.
Well, it's kind of, but it's funny, as much as you have all this opportunity, you still do not have the education that goes with it. I think still for a lot of people, art is a decorative element. It's something that you buy and you cheer up this corner. Are they really like making a connection with the art? Are they really like looking where the artist is coming from or the place that the art belongs? Or are they just looking because I'm having an event, I need something on these walls to do? It may sound like sour grapes, but there's a lot of great energy. There's a lot of great things that happens. But, if you don't have all perspectives rising at the same time, then you're always going to have something that's going to be off kilter. And I think sometimes we celebrate the art in Kansas City too much without being critical about the other factors that belong in it.
Sure.
An educated group, an engaged art, an art that sometimes maybe, tweaks you out a lot, offends you. It's not decorative, it's not entertaining, but it's challenging. And as artists, we can kind of like fall into that idea and say, oh, okay.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of First Fridays when people will just walk through the galleries and they just walk through, even the smaller ones where you have the opportunity to talk to an artist, and a lot of people just won't.
A friend of mine called me up, this was two summers ago, and said, hey, there are these people traveling through, they're taking the old Highway 66, they're kind of duplicating it, and they're coming from Barcelona. This was part of their trip, and she says, can you help me? And it happened to arrive on the First Friday. So we said, oh, sure. We took them. It was a great scene for them. And of course, we walked everywhere because, the Europeans walk. They wanted to see everything and they were absorbing it. And then we ended up at a jazz club down here, the Majestic. It was, she wrote me back after the people arrived back in Spain. They sent her this really lovely note. And the note was, she says, and you got to imagine, they did the whole Route 66. Spent the whole summer. They said that the two things that stuck out to them the most was that First Friday evening. It started like about 5 in the afternoon and didn't end until like 1:30 or 2 in the morning. and then leaving here and going to Dodge City for a rodeo. Those two things stood out to them. It's like, so yeah, there's something that's nice about it, but sometimes you kind of like are looking at it too much that you don't see it sometimes.
Sure. Kind of on that same note, when you were talking about art as decorative instead of being maybe more thought-provoking, just when I was going through some of your stuff, you mentioned as your artist statement, art kind of being more about the work than the commercial side of it. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Well, in the studio, it's really, it's about whatever comes to my mind, whatever I want to do. There's no considerations for anybody. It's just really what the work and I are doing. It's the relationship, the discussion that's taking place there. I painted murals, and that's an interesting thing. There's a dichotomy, because on the one sense I want to be in the studio and be here and that, but the other part of me lives in community. The other part of you belongs somewhere, in a place that's out there. And so the studio's a refuge, the studio's a nice place, but the murals kind of, when I do those, they're about something else. Somebody has, there's a marginalized community or a sense that this area is being basically crapped on. Nobody's paying attention, there's no investment. And yet there's this dearth of spirit, and yet you want to do something positive. So, hey, would you as a muralist come and want to paint something so we can abate the graffiti that's there or something like that? And so that gets you into that sense of that communal thing. But on formal levels, when you're designing and you're composing, it's exactly the things that I'm working in here in the studio. It's the same kind of relationships, form, space, negative space, color areas, line. Those things are still formally in there. So I can kind of like be going back and forth. Only I know,
Right. Yeah, that reminds me, your murals are beautiful.
Well, thank you. But there was 3 of us that started together.
Really? How did that start?
Actually, I was working in North Carolina for the law firm, and I was there for about 1.5 years, and I had just started painting again. It was right before I quit. And so I had like this huge 2-bedroom apartment. So I used one of the rooms. I put up an easel and bought some material, and we had a show because we were going to close the gallery basically. And so we said, well, let's go out with a bang, let's have a show. And the guy didn't want to get involved, but me and this other guy, we said, well, I saw this flyer for this thing called the Latino Guild of Fine Arts. So I called them up, and they were having a show at the Fiesta Mexicana, which is basically a 3-day festival. And so, the worst thing you like to do as an artist is you drag your work out there and put it out for a week, and then you bring it back home. And I was talking to a lady, I said, well, wouldn't it be great if we just had a show for your guild? 2 of the artists that I met there, one was this guy named Jesus Ortiz, he was from Mexico, and the other was Alicia Gambino. And Jesus, we got to talking after the show went up. It was a great success, it was a lot of fun. I was over at his house, and he showed me this huge wall, and he says, I want to paint that someday. And I said, sure. Yeah, mural? He said, oh yeah. And, so when I came back from North Carolina, we started painting it that summer. And that was when we started doing murals. And then after we got done with that mural, he said, I've been invited to go back to Mexico and paint a mural in my hometown. Would you like to come? I said, sure. He says, there's no money, And we went, and then we went, took off that winter, and we stayed there a month and a half. We came back after the second trip. We decided to start doing murals around Kansas City. So we got serious, and then we got phone calls,
Right.
And somebody said, do you want to paint this mural? I said, sure. And then we went and looked and said, oh, freaking God, that thing is huge. I mean, it's like 5 stories high. Can you do it? I said, yeah. You say yes. And then we realized we were all terrified of heights.
I really loved your mural that's on the side of Matty Rhodes. And that, when you were talking about, helping an area or a community that needs help by doing art, that one's beautiful. Can you talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, well, that one had a ready-made theme. I had just come back from a trip to Mexico, and I had actually traveled through Oaxaca. I'd taken a bus and just kind of spent 3 weeks just going through that part. And I was struck by some of the Mayan prints and stuff that I saw. Not just Mayan, they would take up with whatever the ones are. But when I came back here, I was approached to do a mural, and so we started talking, and he's telling me about, Matty Rose is the social service agent. So I said, okay, and then they have an entryway when you go in there. I don't know if you've seen it, it's kind of this blocky,
Yeah, it's beautiful.
cement